Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to testify before the task force today. My emphasis today is on the harmful discriminatory effects of government policies at all levels, local, state, and federal, combined with private employer strategies related to profit-making and workplace configurations. I'll be following on Dr. Spriggs' analysis. Governmental entities played a significant part in promoting and sustaining racist practices, especially before 1964. As a result, those entities bear a direct responsibility for persistent patterns of poverty and low levels of asset accumulation among Black families in California and throughout the nation. Even after the passage of major civil rights legislation in the mid-1960s, private companies such as banks and corporations have engaged in lending and hiring practices that help to solidify patterns of racial inequality. Residential segregation and the harmful effects of U.S. tax policies continue to have adverse effects on Black families. The history of Black women represents a key element in this larger story of public-private complicity in limiting the economic opportunities for all Black people. Many Black Californians today trace their lineage back to the U.S. South, where their forebears were enslaved. The institution of slavery was a massive government-sustained program of wage theft, affecting millions of people of African and indigenous descent. Enslaved women worked in the fields and in the kitchens and parlors of their white masters and mistresses, performing what was traditionally considered men's work, growing crops, as well as women's work. They labored under the constant threat of sexual assault from overseers and plantation owners. The rape of women was an instrument of terrorism, but it was also a means of growing the enslaved workforce, thereby enriching the owner. Between 1619 and 1808, approximately 10 million men, women, and children were forcibly removed from Africa to the Americas. The vast majority went to the Caribbean and South America. Indeed, only about 4 to 6% of the total were transported to what would become the United States. Yet by 1865, the nation's Black population amounted to over 4.4 million people, revealing a dramatic pattern of natural growth over the generations. That number suggests the arduous labors of skilled hands, domestic servants, and bearers of children. Marked by shocking levels of sadism and sexual license, the system of slavery amounted to a form of state-sponsored domestic terrorism. Yet this system found favor with white Northerners, many of whom after 1790 or so benefited directly from the cotton economy, as sea captains, merchants, textile machine operatives, and consumers of cloth. The United States Constitution does not mention the word slavery, but the 1787 document did protect private property, which included enslaved workers. In 1790, Congress stipulated that only free white men should be allowed to immigrate to the United States and eventually apply for citizenship. At the local level, towns and counties sponsored slave patrols, who were groups of white men charged with recovering fugitives and maintaining a racialized order on the countryside. In 1850, a robust Fugitive Slave Act passed by Congress served the explicit interests of Southern slaveholders. During the Civil War, many enslaved people liberated themselves by seeking refuge behind Union lines. Black women labored in refugee camps as servants for Union officers and as laundresses for Union troops. In many cases, neither they nor their menfolk hired as fatigue workers received the financial compensation they had been promised. About 180,000 Black men from both the North and the South served in the Union military, though until the last year of the war, Black soldiers were paid less than their white counterparts. This discriminatory pay scale had profound effects on the well-being of wives, children, and other dependents. For Southern Black soldiers, serving in the Union Army put their loved ones at home at risk for their lives. In the wake of the abolition of slavery, the U.S. government made no concerted effort to compensate the millions of freed people who had literally slaved their whole lives to enrich their owners and the country generally. Most Black men and women emerged from bondage with only the clothes on their backs. They had no cash, land, or credit, prerequisites for self-sufficiency in the rural South. Throughout the rest of the 19th century and well into the 20th, the vast majority of Southern Black families remained landless. confined to the exploitative sharecropping system and living as peons, forced to remain on a plantation until they could discharge their debt as reckoned by the white landowner employer. As late as the 1930s and 40s, many Southern Black families were tilling the soil much as their enslaved forebears had generations before. Beginning in 1890, all of the former Confederate states passed laws or amended their constitutions to deprive Black men of the right to vote. Some states entered into contracts with private employers to supply Black convicts, men and women who had been arrested on flimsy pretexts and sentenced to labor on a chain gang or in a mine or a rice field. At this point, it's helpful to step back and consider larger national trends in the gender division of labor. The Civil War opened up new employment for women in the fields of school teaching, as Dr. Spriggs has discussed, and nursing. Black women who followed these professions were confined to work in under-resourced segregated schools and hospitals. In the late 19th century, the clerical, retail, and manufacturing sectors offered employment opportunities for white women. They were hired as receptionists, department store clerks, and telephone operators, as well as machine operatives. Throughout the country, a higher percentage of Black married women worked than their white counterparts, and Black women stayed in the paid labor force longer than whites, indicators of the need among these women to be joint or sole breadwinners in families that could not subsist on the meager pay of Black menial jobs. Overall, these trends suggested that Black women would be excluded from so-called modern forms of work, using machines as typewriters, textile looms, or sewing machines, and those defined by a set number of hours each day. Large-scale migration out of the South did not take place until World War I, when for the first time Northern and Midwestern defense industries beckoned with well-paying jobs. Black women were an integral part of this migration, contributing to the war effort as workers in factories and on railroads. President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal of the 1930s brought Northern African Americans into the Democratic Party in great numbers, but in the South, federal aid and public works programs were controlled by local white politicians. These officials saw no need to assist the large number of Black families devastated and displaced by the collapsing cotton economy, arguing that if there was laundry to be done or cotton to be picked for white folks, state and federal government should not provide Blacks with jobs or relief of any kind. During the 1930s, for the first time in the nation's history, the federal government sought to mitigate the harsh effects of unfettered employer power when it came to wages, hours, and working conditions. Nevertheless, the signal achievements of this era, Social Security and minimum hour, maximum wage, and anti-child labor legislation, explicitly denied these benefits to workers in the agricultural and domestic service sectors, and to anyone who held a seasonal or part-time job. These restrictions affected approximately 85% of all Black workers in the United States. And two, federal initiatives often mandated racial segregation. In the Civilian Conservation Corps, for example, a New Deal program, the Federal Housing Authority of 1934, required that new housing be segregated if building contractors were to qualify for government loans. California has always beckoned to all kinds of people. For a number of reasons, Black people did not take part in this pre-1941 migration in large numbers, at least, for several reasons. Many lacked the means to buy a train ticket. Even those who could afford a car knew that the cross-country journey was a perilous one, without predictable sources of fuel for the car or food for the body along the way. Most significantly, though, California employers already had an abundant supply of labor, and major manufacturers made it clear that they would not hire Black applicants, male or female. It was not until the nation was well into World War II that the state's employers felt an acute labor shortage. Even then, it took the combined pressure of the state's NAACP, National Urban League, and Congress of Racial Equality to open the factory gates to African Americans. Blacks in California were also part of a national movement. the Double V for Victory campaign to defeat fascism abroad and racism at home, the sudden availability of well-paying defense jobs for Black men in 1942 and for Black women not until 1943 or so, led to 5 million Black people migrating out of the South and into the Northeast, Midwest, and West Coast. Seemingly overnight, the newcomers transformed whole regions of California, including the San Francisco Bay Area. The intense demand for labor was not sufficient to overcome generations-long practices that adversely affected Black women and men. At the beginning of the war, in response to pressure from Black activists, the federal government created the Fair Employment Practices Commission, FEPC, an agency that monitored federal defense industry contracts to ensure job opportunities for Black workers. At the same time, a government job placement agency, the United States Employment Service, and its Women's Advisory Commission catered to the prejudices of white employers and their workers. Some Black women were hired as welders and riveters, factory jobs that paid well, allowing them to contribute directly to the war effort and bolstering their confidence as workers and citizens. Yet it remained difficult, if not impossible, for individual Black people to challenge generations-old all-white workplaces. As thousands of migrants streamed into the Bay Area, the housing shortage deepened, forcing many Black families into makeshift, ramshackle, cramped quarters. Like women in general, Black women had to scramble to find childcare as local, state, and federal governments persisted in their historic refusal to provide support services for mothers of young children. Even though many women were working full-time, some on the night shift on behalf of the war effort. The war temporarily broke down some long-standing barriers so that women could perform what was previously designated as women's work, welding, riveting, and carpentry, for example. Yet after the war, women were displaced from their factory jobs by returning soldiers. White women resumed work as retail clerks and clerical staff, while Black women remained limited to employment as household domestics, cafeteria workers, and hospital aides. By 1950, the FEPC had been disbanded, and once again, employers could freely advertise that no Negroes need apply. Black unemployment rates soared. Because Black families continued to face stubborn challenges stemming from job discrimination and housing segregation, Black women's labor continued to be essential to the well-being of their households. While white men took advantage of the GI Bill to go to college, many Black men found their chances for higher education foreclosed by the lack of accredited, that is, white, colleges that would admit them. Banks engaged in pernicious redlining practices, which denied mortgage loans to even middle-class Black workers if they were living in an overwhelmingly Black area. In 1950, almost 30% of Black men between the ages of 20 and 24 were jobless, and employment patterns continued to reflect a Jim Crow occupational hierarchy. Residential segregation in particular played a major role in thwarting the aspirations of Black women in their roles as wives, mothers, and workers. Confined to impoverished neighborhoods, they often faced long commutes to work. Their inability to purchase a home meant that they would remain at the mercy of landlords who realized they housed a captive group of people who could not afford to move. In the suburbs, so-called neighborhood improvement associations put pressure on homeowners not to sell to people of color, a trend supported by real estate agents and city councils. All white towns enlisted local police in discouraging Black families from moving into their neighborhoods. The Federal Housing Authority and the Veterans Administration refused to grant loans to Black veterans who wanted to buy houses in white areas. City authorities segregated public housing, refusing to build enough units to accommodate the numbers of Black applicants. Federal policy favored suburban homeowners over urban renters by providing tax breaks for interest on mortgage payments, by creating an interstate highway system that frequently decimated Black communities, and by refusing to loan money to housing contractors who refused to segregate any new developments they built. The combined effects of these policies and practices among bankers, real estate agents, city officials and builders meant that over the generations, Black families would lack the assets of their white counterparts who owned their own homes. In the post-war period, government jobs became the bedrock of many Black families. Black men and women worked as bus drivers, social workers, and teachers. Nevertheless, some public sectors such as law enforcement and firefighting resisted integrating their ranks, using formal examinations and other machinations as pretexts for discrimination. And some work sites, once integrated, showed hostility toward people of color, making life miserable for them. The Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 1965 marked the end of the federal government's active attempts to apply discriminatory policies to housing and unemployment, and the beginning of federal enforcement of voting laws. With the crumbling of legislative mandates upholding racial segregation, and with affirmative efforts by colleges and employers to admit Black people in meaningful numbers for the first time, a segment of the Black population began to thrive, especially the well-educated. Yet the absence of legal barriers was not sufficient to open the way to a brighter future for many Black women. Indeed, a confluence of events in the 1960s and 70s conspired to keep large numbers in poverty and relegated to low-paying, disagreeable jobs. The Immigration Act of 1965 opened the country to groups who competed with Black people for unskilled jobs. By this time, certain industries had taken advantage of local tax incentives and moved to the suburbs, making it difficult for people who did not own cars to get to work. Other industries took their production facilities offshore or to Mexico in an attempt to avoid American unions and minimum wage and maximum hour laws. The global economy hit Black workers hard in the sectors they were just beginning to enter, textile production, for example. Some white-collar jobs, such as bank teller, were reduced or eliminated with the increased use of computers and robotics. In addition, a tax revolt among suburban taxpayers began to register in municipal budgets as towns and cities began to cut back on public employment in the transportation, education, and social welfare sectors, adversely affecting Black people who represented a disproportionate number of workers in those jobs. People in distressed communities such as Watts and Compton lacked access to well-paying jobs that did not require a college education, and they lacked the resources to move into middle-class white suburbs. The available jobs were concentrated in the service industry: fast food workers, home health aides, childcare workers. Without a substantial tax base, the public schools in these areas were unable to provide an adequate education to prepare students for the challenges of the 21st century global workforce. Underground economies thrived, and police targeted Black men and youth for nonviolent offenses such as drug use, leading to high rates of incarceration and leaving wives and mothers to try to piece together a living on their own. Recent studies suggest the limitations of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Title VII, as a force for a level playing field when it comes to employment opportunities. Some employers persist in discriminatory practices, now using a person's zip code as a proxy for their race. The rise of a service economy and the decline in manufacturing have limited the number of well-paying jobs for people with only a high school degree. In the early 2000s, banks switched from redlining communities of color to pushing predatory loans on them, leading to high rates of foreclosure, especially after the financial crisis of 2008. Perhaps most significantly for most middle-class Americans, equity in a home is a family's largest asset in terms of their total net worth. In 2016, the net worth of a typical white family was nearly 10 times greater than that of a Black family, $171,000 versus $17,000. Generations of Black women as workers, wives, and mothers have paid a high price for these forms of discrimination, their talents squandered and their dreams dashed. In 2019, the Public Policy Institute of California reported that about 1/3, or 34% of the state's residents were poor or near poor, including more than 1/5 of all Latinas and 17.4% of African Americans, compared to 12% of whites. While 12% of white women were impoverished, the figure for Black women was 23%. In 2019, the median annual earnings of white women stood at $55,000, for Black women, $44,000. The discrepancy was even greater for men, $71,000 for white men, $48,000 for Black men. The COVID pandemic has had disastrous effects on Black communities. Some Black women lost their jobs as waitresses, fast food workers, and custodians, and others are overrepresented as frontline workers, serving as hospital orderlies and home health care workers, making more of them vulnerable to the virus. By way of conclusion, I do not mean to argue that Black Californians are the only group in the state who have endured systematic prejudice over the generations. However, the history of African Californians is unique because many of their forebears were enslaved in the American South. Government at all levels have initiated and enforced policies that limited Blacks' employment opportunities in direct and long-lasting ways. Indeed, federal agencies, local city officials, and school boards, law enforcement officers, together with state legislative and congressional inaction, have played a major role in limiting the ability of Black women to achieve material success and their highest potential. Thank you very much.